There comes a moment when a deeply sensitive person stops explaining themselves, not because they have nothing left to say, but because they have finally realized that not everyone is listening to understand. For a long time, they may have tried to clarify their intentions, defend their feelings, and repair every misunderstanding. But eventually, something changes. They begin to understand that emotional intelligence isn't always about finding the perfect words. Sometimes it is about recognizing when words are no longer helping and having the self-awareness to step back, regulate your emotions, and let silence create the space that constant explanation never could. There is a subtle moment in emotional growth when we begin to notice something important. The way other people see us does not always have to determine the way we see ourselves. For a deeply empathetic person, this can be a difficult lesson. When you are highly attuned to the emotions of others, you may also become highly sensitive to their reactions. A raised eyebrow, a change in someone's tone, or a moment of distance can lead you to wonder, did I do something wrong? And before you know it, you are explaining yourself, not because you truly need to, but because you want to restore a sense of connection. This is where self-awareness becomes so important. Self-awareness is the ability to notice what is happening inside us while it is happening. We begin to recognize the difference between a genuine need to communicate and an emotional urge to be approved of. Those two things can look very similar from the outside, but internally, they are quite different. Imagine someone misunderstanding your intentions. Your first instinct may be to explain every detail. You tell them what you meant, why you said it, how you felt, and what you were trying to communicate. But if you notice yourself becoming increasingly anxious as they fail to understand, that anxiety may be telling you something. Perhaps you are no longer communicating for the sake of clarity. Perhaps you are trying to control how another person perceives you. Emotional intelligence gives us the ability to pause at that moment. We can ask ourselves, have I communicated what I needed to communicate? If the answer is yes, we may not need to keep explaining. We can allow another person to have their interpretation even when we disagree with it. This does not mean we become indifferent. It means we develop the capacity to tolerate being misunderstood without immediately abandoning our own emotional stability. That is a significant shift. We move from asking, how can I make them understand me, to asking, do I understand myself? The first question places our emotional well-being in someone else's hands. The second brings our attention back to where we have the greatest influence, within ourselves. For an empath, this can feel like a quiet kind of freedom. You can still care deeply, you can still listen, you can still communicate with compassion, but you no longer feel compelled to explain every part of yourself to earn acceptance. And sometimes that is when silence becomes meaningful, not as a punishment, not as withdrawal, but as a sign that you have finally become comfortable enough with your own inner clarity that you no longer need everyone else to confirm it. There is a hidden cost to constantly explaining yourself, and it is one that many emotionally sensitive people don't recognize until they are already exhausted. When you care deeply about relationships, you may feel responsible for making sure everyone understands your intentions. If someone misunderstands you, you explain. If they become upset, you explain again. If there is tension, you search for the right words, hoping that one more conversation will finally restore harmony. But sometimes, the more we explain, the more emotionally depleted we become. The problem is not communication itself. Healthy communication is essential to relationships. The difficulty begins when explanation becomes a way of managing another person's perception of us. We start believing that if we can just find the perfect words, we can prevent conflict eliminate misunderstanding, and make everyone feel comfortable. But human beings don't always respond to information rationally. Our emotions, past experiences, expectations, and personal biases all influence the way we interpret what others say. This means that even the clearest explanation may not change someone's mind. For an empath, accepting this reality can be particularly challenging. Because they are often sensitive to emotional tension, they may experience another person's misunderstanding as something that must immediately be repaired. The discomfort becomes difficult to tolerate. So they continue talking, clarifying, defending, and reassuring. Yet, instead of creating connection, the conversation can gradually become a cycle of emotional exhaustion. This is where emotional intelligence asks something different from us. It asks us to notice what is happening inside our own minds. Are we explaining because the situation genuinely requires clarification? Or are we explaining because we are uncomfortable with the possibility that someone may not understand us? That distinction matters when we become aware of the emotional cost of constant explanation. We begin to understand the importance of boundaries. We realize that we can communicate honestly without taking responsibility for how every person receives our words. We can offer clarity without demanding agreement. We can express our feelings without trying to control another person's response. This doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. In fact, it can lead to more authentic relationships. When we stop over-explaining, our communication often becomes simpler and more direct. We say what we mean, listen to the other person, and then allow the conversation to unfold without constantly trying to manage its outcome. There is a certain maturity in realizing that not every misunderstanding requires a lengthy defense. Sometimes you have already explained yourself clearly. The next step is not to find better words. It is to accept that understanding cannot be forced. And when you learn that, you begin to protect something that is often overlooked in emotional relationships, your own mental and emotional energy. There is an important difference between choosing silence and being silenced by our emotions. When we think about emotional regulation, we often imagine someone who remains calm no matter what happens. But emotional regulation is not the absence of emotion. It is the ability to experience an emotion without allowing that emotion to immediately control our behavior. For an empath, this distinction can be especially meaningful. When you are highly sensitive to the emotional atmosphere around you, you may notice things that others overlook. You sense tension in someone's voice. You recognize when a conversation is becoming uncomfortable. You feel the frustration behind someone's words, even when they don't express it directly. This sensitivity can be a strength, but it can also become overwhelming when you absorb too much emotional information at once. In those moments, silence can create something valuable, a pause. That pause gives the brain an opportunity to move from emotional reaction toward thoughtful response. When we are emotionally activated, our attention can narrow. We become focused on defending ourselves, proving our intentions, or responding to what feels like a threat. The stronger the emotion, the more difficult it can be to consider the situation from another perspective. A moment of silence can interrupt that cycle. Instead of immediately responding to criticism, we can take a breath. Instead of sending the message we might later regret, we can wait. Instead of continuing an argument simply because we feel misunderstood, we can step back and ask ourselves what outcome we actually want. This is not emotional suppression. Suppression says, I shouldn't feel this. Regulation says, I feel this and I can choose what I do next. That difference is fundamental. When an empath learns to regulate emotions, silence becomes a form of self-awareness. It allows them to observe their internal experience without becoming completely identified with it. They can recognize anger without becoming aggressive. They can recognize sadness without immediately seeking reassurance. They can recognize disappointment without turning it into a judgment about their own worth. And sometimes silence also protects the relationship itself. Not every thought needs to be expressed in the exact moment it appears. Not every emotional reaction deserves immediate action. There are times when the most constructive response is to create enough distance for the intensity of the emotion to settle. After that pause, we may still choose to speak. But now we speak from greater clarity rather than emotional urgency. This is one of the quiet strengths of emotional intelligence. It gives us the ability to create space between what we feel and what we do. In that space, we regain choice. So when an empath becomes quiet, we should not automatically assume that they are withdrawing, punishing someone, or losing their voice. Sometimes they are simply learning to listen to themselves before responding to the world around them. And that kind of silence can be powerful, not because it avoids emotion, but because it creates the freedom to respond to emotion with awareness. Perhaps the deepest lesson is this: you do not always need to explain yourself to be worthy of understanding. You do not have to convince everyone of your intentions, defend every feeling, or carry the responsibility of making every person see you clearly. There will be moments when your words are necessary, and there will be moments when your silence says enough. Emotional intelligence is not about becoming less caring. It is about learning to care without losing yourself in the process. It is knowing when to speak, when to listen, when to pause, and when to let go. It is recognizing that empathy is a gift, but it becomes healthier when it is balanced with self-awareness, emotional regulation, and strong personal boundaries. So if you have reached a point where you no longer feel the need to explain every part of yourself, don't be afraid of that change. Perhaps you are not becoming distant. Perhaps you are becoming more secure within yourself. Perhaps you are finally realizing that your peace does not depend on everyone understanding you. Let your silence be thoughtful, not bitter. Let your boundaries be clear, not cruel. And let your words, when you choose to speak, come from a place of clarity rather than fear. Remember, your emotional energy is valuable. Give it wisely. Not every misunderstanding deserves your exhaustion. Not every disagreement requires your defense. And not every person needs access to the deepest parts of who you are. Thank you for spending these moments with me and reflecting on the quiet relationship we have with our own emotions. I hope this message gives you something meaningful to carry into your relationships, your conversations, and your own inner life. Wherever you are in your journey, I wish you the courage to understand yourself, the wisdom to protect your peace, and the emotional strength to respond to life with greater awareness. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the very best of luck on your journey toward greater self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and inner peace. Take care of yourself and keep moving forward with clarity, compassion, and courage